Giambattista Callegari, A Memory by Ciro Discepolo. On Via Sant'Anna dei Lombardi in Naples at number 44, in a courtyard among those old buildings in the historic center, stands the artisan workshop of Raffaele Troas, a charming old man, a Capricorn, with a perpetually unlit cigar in his hand. I meet him many years after our last conversation. Everything is as it once was, only a table covered with old papers, a few electrical capacitors in a glass ashtray, a measuring instrument from another era, very old furniture, clippings of articles on the walls, a few cups won over the years. Troas is always the same. Every now and then he notices that his cigar is unlit and tries unsuccessfully to relight it, but perhaps his intention in this regard is precisely to not smoke. Today, like many years ago, he builds a few Callegari control units, small handcrafted jewels, destined more for export than for Italy, 850,000 lire for a small machine that requires a lot of work. I only make the ones I need to live. When I have enough to eat, I stop. That's why buyers have to wait so long. About 2,400 control units since the first one. My thoughts wander back to my first encounters with experimental radiobiology. Luciano Cataneo, a nuclear physicist and scholar of the mystery, author of the following excellent article, not in this issue, editor's note, told me that digging through the old records of the Callegari Center, he found my name among the members from 1970 to 1971. That was a brief magical season in which, concurrently with the transit of Uranus over my radix Neptune, the second dominant of my birth chart, I avidly delved into analytical psychology, yoga, astrology, homeopathic medicine, radiobiology. I met Callegari and he immediately won me over. A straightforward Aries, undiplomatic, even a bit brusque. He lived in an old house on Corso Novara, in a working-class neighborhood of Naples. He lived there for a good part of his life with his Pisces wife and their son, who would later become an engineer. His other son died at a very young age, following a panic attack during a bombing. Naples meant to him the Saturn in the ninth house, which looms somewhat ominously in his birth chart. He could have become very rich, but instead he lived very modestly, but with dignity, his entire life. I had many meetings with him. We talked at length, sometimes for entire afternoons. I also had the honor of taking chess lessons by correspondence from him, who had been a runner-up in Italy. I spent 2 or 3 years in total, assiduously, but then, for various reasons, it was no longer possible. Last June I felt the urge to visit him again, but I held off because I feared he might be angry with me for the long silence. I decided to write a piece about him in Ricerca 90 and contacted Dr. Cataneo. A few days later, Callegari died of a heart attack in his old home on Corso Novara. Many books could be written about Giambattista Callegari. I myself, if I could, would write one. He was an extraordinary figure, perhaps one of the greatest scientists of this century, even if relatively little known. The Palazzo, of course, always ignored him, if not ridiculed him, but many admired him unconditionally. He was better known abroad than in Italy. In Toronto, the National College awarded him an honorary degree in physics and appointed him to a chair in experimental radiobiology. The first time I heard about the Callegari power station was when I was working at the National Research Council. A colleague of mine had a father dying of cancer and, in desperation, turned to a doctor who used a little machine with a pendulum. He placed a photograph of the patient in a circuit and performed some operations. A few hours later, the patient's bleeding stopped, which the doctors deemed irreversible and final. In the following days, my friend's father improved, got out of bed, and even ate. He had other seizures, and finally, after about a month, died. The operator at the Callegari power station had never misled the family, pointing out the extreme seriousness of the case. More out of curiosity than anything else, I began frequenting the Callegari Study Center on Via Cisterna dell'Olio in a dilapidated building in that very old Naples celebrated by Giuseppe Marotta, that Naples of the stage where, alongside the 1,000 daily miracles of a population trying to find a way to combat a poverty that has the characteristics of a biblical curse, there can be cases like this one where a few people gather and talk about atomic physics, Planck, Einstein, and perhaps even create a piece of universal history. This miraculous control unit, which, according to the disciples of the Master from Feltre, was practically omnipotent, could, they claim, diagnose and cure any disease as long as it wasn't in its most advanced stages, search for missing persons, find water or oil underground, and answer virtually any question, even for people thousands of kilometers away. The photograph of the subject, they explained to me, is nothing more than a specific electromagnetic emanation, distinctive only to that subject, and it is precisely on that subject that the K effect acts. I realize that recounting this today, and without first adequately explaining the scientific foundations of Callegari's discovery, which, incidentally, I'm not even sure I'm adequately equipped to explain, all this might seem absurd, ridiculous. But when Professor Callegari told me about saving Gagarin's life during the first manned spaceflight, April 12, 1961, on Vostok 1, there was no emphasis in his voice. He explained casually that he had kept the astronaut's photograph in the active circuit of his control unit throughout the flight, which suddenly had signaled a severe cardiac crisis in the cosmonaut. He had applied the necessary wave, and our man had been saved. I heard many stories like these, and of one thing I'm certain. Callegari was neither a liar, nor a fraud, nor a fanatic. He was a profoundly honest man, a scientist of the highest caliber who never compromised, and who is remembered by all as a benefactor. He offered his services day and night free of charge. He never asked for anything for himself. He was reserved and refused interviews, but not out of shyness. I bombarded him with questions, and he answered me, not always patiently. One day he told me that the control unit wasn't patented because he had refused to explain the basic principle on which it worked. I want to prevent it from being used to cause harm, he said, adding that only 30 years after his death would important envelopes be opened. When cholera struck Naples between the summer and autumn of 1973, Callegari applied a specific wave from his control unit to the photograph of the Naples aqueduct. All this may sound like science fiction, but I repeat, a book wouldn't be enough to tell it all. At the Callegari Center, I used to lead researchers, mostly Belgian and French, from the International Institute of Genetics and Biophysics on Via Marconi in front of the RAI television station. They went there convinced they were witnessing the usual Neapolitan scam, and they put Dr. Oreste Bellini, a medical student, to the test. I once witnessed this episode. A Belgian biologist brought with him a photograph of one of his two children and placed it, without the operator's eyes, under the oscillating circuit. Then he asked to know the sex of the boy or girl, according to the machine. Dr. Bellini searched for an answer but was clearly having difficulty. "The pendulum shows me a subject who is both female and male at the same time," the doctor declared after a while. "Impossible," replied the other. "Do you mean I don't know whose children I have?" To make a long story short, the photograph was brought out and everyone present saw that it was the portrait of a boy to whom the arms from a girl's photograph had been applied. Later, I also purchased a waveform machine, and for many years carried out experiments with conflicting results. I treated my wife, who suffered from sinusitis. When we returned from the beach in the summer, she always had a severe headache. I applied the waveform the center had prescribed to me, and the headache went away. Some days, without her knowing, I applied the waveform directly in the morning, and she didn't have any headaches at all. Unfortunately, however, the waveform machine was unable to do anything for my headaches, and perhaps for this reason I distanced myself from it, simultaneously with the growth of my passion for astrology. Another time I witnessed this same episode. Another colleague of mine from the CNR brought a photograph of his little girl and gave it to Dr. Bellini. He told him that his daughter was seriously ill, she later died, and that she was in a hospital in northern Italy undergoing surgery. He placed a map on the table and asked to know which city she was in. In those days, to his credit, the director of the Callegari Center accepted this kind of challenge without any polemical impulse. He told my friend that if he had to search everywhere, we would have been there for several hours. He then asked him to write down about 20 city names on the map, and from there he began his analysis. He said, and I heard it with my own ears, that the little girl with that size of map appeared to be located between Pisa and Massa Carrara, but that if he had had access to increasingly detailed maps, he could have also indicated the street where she was located at that moment. The little girl was indeed in Massa Carrara, undergoing surgery by Azzolina. I myself built a rudimentary instrument to perform a basic experiment, recommended by Callegari, to demonstrate the truth of the principle on which his theory was based. I wound a small metal spiral of very precise dimensions, capable of oscillating at the wavelength indicated by the Belluno scholar. At the center, I attached a small axis with a small mirror on top. There was also another wire, controlled from the outside, which served to short-circuit the two leads, poles, of the coil. The whole thing was protected in a plexiglass enclosure and placed on a stable base, sheltered from drafts, oscillating walls, and so on. When the coil was short-circuited, the axis inside it underwent a slight but very noticeable torsion, which the mirror made more visible. According to official physics, this cannot happen because no electrical power was supplied to the circuit. Conversely, the experiment demonstrated the reality of the K effect, which operates in the wavelength range between radar and visual frequencies. Some physicists to whom I showed the experiment couldn't explain it to me. The same is illustrated in one of the now unobtainable texts listed further down in the bibliography, though today, July 2025, engineer Giuseppe Callegari, son of Giambattista Callegari, has published several of his father's books, and they are available to everyone. I witnessed this episode another time. A woman was mistakenly directed to me to inquire about her sister, who had been missing for a fortnight. I told her there was nothing I could do, but I couldn't, nevertheless, feel like leaving her in that state of despair. So I called Callegari, who agreed to see us that same evening. The woman brought the photograph with her, and the professor put it in his car. But first he questioned the woman at length. Then he made his decision. Her sister had been dead for several days, having drowned, and her body was found off the coast of Trieste, where she had last been seen alive. The woman didn't believe a word of it, and left without even thanking Giambattista Callegari for his kindness, a fact which I regretted, since I had in fact initiated that meeting. But a week later, I heard from the woman. Her sister's body had been found off the coast of Bari, and the poor woman had died many days earlier. Professor Fusco of the Institute of Occupational Medicine, a scholar of physics, mathematics, and electronics, was introduced by me to Callegari and engaged in heated and contentious discussions with him in my presence. For entire afternoons the two faced off, the doctor being absolutely skeptical of Callegari's discoveries. But little by little things changed, and Professor Fusco became a leading scholar of experimental radiobiology. He was conducting interesting experiments with Warburg's apparatus on microorganisms when he sadly died in a car accident. My thoughts return to today, and I respond to the friendly smile of Raphael Troyes, who stands before me. I think that anyone who enters this little room will never have the sacred respect usually shown for the temples of science, where science reigns supreme. But I also think of the many truths of the past that, even in their humblest guise, are just waiting to be revealed. In this sense, I will gladly reread The Morning of the Magicians by Pauwels and Bergier. Ciro Discepolo, many years ago.